I still remember the sound of their laughter echoing behind me as I walked through those heavy metal doors for the last time. Marcus Chun, 18 years old, officially aged out of the foster care system with nothing but a backpack containing 2 hoodies, 3 t-shirts, 1 pair of jeans with a hole in the knee, and a single photograph of a woman whose face I could barely remember. The staff at Riverside Youth Center had that look in their eyes, the one I'd seen 1,000 times before. The look that said I was just another statistic waiting to happen, another kid about to disappear into the streets, another name they'd forget by next month. Another failure of a system that was designed to help, but mostly just processed kids like inventory. The youth center had been my home for the past 5 years, ever since I was 13, when my mother overdosed in a motel room 3 states away. Before that, it had been a chaotic rotation of foster homes, some better than others, most just places where I took up space and consumed resources. I wasn't a troublemaker, not really. I just had this problem with authority figures who demanded respect they hadn't earned and rules that existed for no reason except that they'd always existed. That attitude doesn't win you many friends when you're a ward of the state, when you're completely dependent on the goodwill of people who are already stretched too thin and tired of dealing with damaged kids. My mother used to tell me I got my stubborn streak from my father, whoever he was. She never talked about him much, just said he'd left before I was born and that I had his eyes, dark and intense, the kind that made people uncomfortable when I looked at them too long. She also mentioned once, during one of her sober periods that never lasted long enough, that I reminded her of her mother, my grandmother. A woman who'd apparently been tough as nails and twice as sharp, who'd raised my mother on a farm somewhere before everything fell apart. But that was about all I knew. My mother's past was a locked door I'd never been given the key to. The morning I turned 18, Mr. Harrison, the director of Riverside, called me into his office with that expression he'd perfected over 2 decades of delivering bad news to kids who'd already heard too much of it. He sat me down in the chair across from his cluttered desk and explained, in that tone that tried to sound sympathetic but came off as rehearsed, that I had exactly 48 hours to collect my belongings and vacate the premises. They needed the bed for younger kids, he said, kids who still had time in the system, kids they might actually be able to help. He slid a folder across the desk containing information about homeless shelters, job placement programs, and a list of churches that provided free meals. Then he wished me luck with the kind of smile that said he didn't actually believe luck would do me any good. I took the folder, nodded politely because I'd learned that arguing with people in power was pointless, and walked back to my room to pack up the scattered remains of my existence. My roommate, Derek, had aged out 3 months earlier, and I hadn't heard from him since. He'd left me a note that said, "Don't let this place break you." But the system had already done its work on Derek. I'd seen it in his eyes the last few weeks, that hollow look that came from realizing nobody was coming to save you, and you probably weren't equipped to save yourself. On my last night at Riverside, I sat on my bed staring at that photograph I'd kept hidden in my pillowcase for 5 years. It showed a young woman, probably in her early 20s, with dark hair and a tired smile, holding a toddler who was laughing at something off camera, and my mother and I, taken during one of the good periods that became fewer and farther between as I got older. On the back, in faded blue ink, someone had written Marcus and Elena, summer 2007. I didn't remember that day, didn't remember that laugh, didn't remember a time when my mother looked that happy. But I kept the photo anyway, because it was proof that things had once been different, that I'd come from somewhere before the system swallowed me whole. The other kids at Riverside weren't exactly throwing me a going-away party. Jake and Cameron, 2 brothers who'd been there almost as long as I, made jokes in the common room about how long it would take before I was strung out on drugs or locked up for stealing. Ashley, who'd always resented the fact that I read books instead of watching TV with everyone else, announced loudly that she gave me 2 weeks before I came crawling back, begging them to take me in again, like that was even an option. Even some of the younger kids, The ones I'd helped with homework and stood up for when the older kids got mean, looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear, like my failure was something they could catch if they got too close. I left on a Thursday morning in early October when the air had that sharp autumn chill that cuts through cheap jackets and reminds you that winter is coming, whether you're ready or not. The sky was gray and low, threatening rain, which felt appropriate given the circumstances. I'd managed to save up about $200 from the part-time job I'd had washing dishes at a diner downtown, 3 nights a week for $8.50 an hour, getting home after midnight, and falling into bed with hands that still smelled like bleach and grease. It wasn't much money, but it was something. It was mine. I'd earned it, and nobody could take it away from me. Mrs. Chun, the owner of the diner, had pulled me aside on my last shift and told me I was welcome to come back anytime if I needed work. She'd looked at me with genuine concern, which was more than most people offered, and pressed an extra $50 into my hand over my protests. She said her own son had aged out of foster care years ago, and she knew how hard it was. I wanted to ask her how her son had turned out, whether he'd made it, but I was afraid of the answer. Some stories don't have happy endings, and I wasn't sure I could handle hearing another one of them right then. I spent my first night of freedom, if you could call it that, on a bench in Oakwood Park, about a mile from Riverside. It wasn't as bad as you might imagine. The weather was still mild enough that I didn't freeze, and I'd chosen a spot under a streetlight where I felt relatively safe. I kept my backpack close and didn't sleep much, just dozed in short intervals while watching the city move around me in the darkness. Something is humbling about becoming invisible, about watching people walk past without even glancing at you, probably assuming you're just some kid waiting for a ride or killing time before heading home. They had no idea I didn't have a home to go to, that the bench I was sitting on was all I had. Around 2 a.m., a police officer stopped and asked for my ID, checking to make sure I wasn't a runaway. When I showed him my identification and explained I'd just aged out of foster care, his expression shifted from suspicious to sympathetic, which somehow felt worse. He told me about a shelter on the east side that took people my age, gave me directions, and moved on to whatever else occupied his night. I didn't go to the shelter. I'd heard stories from other kids about what those places were like, how your stuff got stolen, how you had to be out by 6 a.m. regardless of whether you had anywhere to go, how the rules were often stricter than they'd been in the youth center. At least on the bench, I only had to answer myself. The next morning, I used the bathroom at a gas station to wash my face and brush my teeth, trying to make myself look presentable enough to job hunt. The fluorescent lights in that bathroom were merciless, showing me a guy who looked older than 18. With dark circles under those intense eyes I'd inherited from my unknown father and a jawline that needed a shave I couldn't afford to worry about yet. My black hair was too long, hanging into my eyes, but haircuts cost money I didn't have. I did my best with wet paper towels and the travel-size bottle of soap I'd taken from Riverside, changed into my least wrinkled shirt, and practiced smiling in the mirror. The reflection didn't look convinced. I spent the next 10 days in a cycle that became numbingly familiar. Wake up wherever I'd managed to sleep, usually the park or occasionally under a bridge when it rained. Clean up as best I could in public restrooms. Spend the day walking from business to business, filling out applications, getting rejected or ignored. Use my remaining cash to buy the cheapest food I could find, usually dollar menu items or gas station snacks that didn't fill me up but kept the worst of the hunger away. By evening, I'd find somewhere to spend the night and try to sleep despite the cold that was getting worse as October wore on and winter approached. The rejections came in various forms, but they all meant the same thing. Some places took one look at my application, saw the lack of a permanent address, and suddenly remembered they weren't actually hiring despite the help wanted sign in the window. Others were more direct, explaining that they needed someone stable, someone reliable, someone who wouldn't be a liability. A few actually brought me in for interviews, and I thought maybe I had a chance until they asked where I was currently living, and my honest answer killed whatever interest they'd had. You can't get a job without an address, and you can't get an address without a job. It's a trap designed to keep people exactly where they are, and I was firmly caught in it. By day 11, my $200 had dwindled to $47. I'd been eating less, sleeping worse, and starting to understand why some people in my situation made desperate choices. When you're hungry and cold, and every door keeps closing in your face, when the legal options have all been exhausted, and you're running out of time and money and hope, desperation starts to look like logic. I hadn't reached that point yet, but I could see it on the horizon, waiting for me. That's when something strange happened. I was sitting on my usual bench in Oakwood Park, trying to decide whether to spend $3 on food or save it for something else, when an elderly man sat down beside me. He was probably in his 70s, wearing clean work clothes and a jacket that had seen better days but was still serviceable. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there feeding pigeons from a bag of breadcrumbs he'd brought with him. After a few minutes, he turned to me and asked, "You Marcus Chin?" I immediately went on guard. I'd learned that strangers knowing your name was rarely a good thing. "Who's asking?" I said, ready to grab my backpack and run if necessary. He smiled, and it was a kind smile, the kind that reached his eyes and made the wrinkles around them deeper. "Name's Robert Sullivan. I've been looking for you for about 2 weeks now. Checked with social services, went by Riverside. They told me you'd aged out. Been asking around the neighborhood, figured you might still be in the area. You're a hard young man to track down. Why are you looking for me?" I asked, my mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with wax that had cracked over time. "Because your grandmother, Dorothy Chun, asked me to give you this when you turned 18. I promised her I would, and I'm a man who keeps his promises, even if it takes some doing." I stared at the envelope, not moving to take it. "My grandmother's dead. Has been for years." "That's right," Robert said gently. "She passed 5 years ago, when you were 13. I was her neighbor, lived on the farm next to hers for 40 years. Good woman, your grandmother. Tough life, but she never complained. When she knew she was dying, she gave me this envelope and made me promise to find you when you became an adult and give it to you personally. Said it was important, said you'd need it when the time came." He held out the envelope, and after a moment's hesitation, I took it. It was heavier than I expected, and something inside rattled when I moved it. My name was written on the front in careful handwriting, Marcus Chun, to be delivered on his 18th birthday. The sight of my name written in what I assumed was my grandmother's hand made my chest tight. "What is it?" I asked. Robert shrugged. "Don't know. She never told me, and I never asked. Wasn't my business. But she was very insistent that you get it. Said it was your inheritance, your birthright. She felt terrible about what happened with your mother. Terrible that she couldn't take you in herself when things went bad. She was already sick by then, couldn't pass the home study, and nobody would place a kid with someone who was dying. But she wanted you to have something, wanted you to know she thought about you." Before I could respond, Robert stood up, dusted off his pants, and gave me a small nod. "I've done what I promised. The rest is up to you, son. But if you need any help, if you head out to Meadowbrook County and need someone to vouch for you, you can find me at Sullivan's Feed and Grain in Hartwell. Tell anyone there you're looking for Robert, and they'll point you my way. Good luck, Marcus. Your grandmother believed you'd do all right. Don't prove her wrong." And then he walked away, leaving me sitting on that bench with an envelope that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. I sat there for a long time, just staring at it, afraid to open it, afraid of what I might find or not find inside. Finally, as the afternoon light started to fade and the park began to empty, I carefully broke the wax seal and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, written in the same careful handwriting as my name on the envelope, and a single old-fashioned key attached to a ring with a small metal tag that had an address stamped into it. My hands were shaking as I unfolded the letter and began to read. "My dear Marcus, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've become a man. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to see it. Sorry I couldn't be the grandmother you deserved. Life didn't work out the way I hoped, and I failed your mother in ways I'll regret until my last breath. But I won't fail you if I can help it. This key opens the door to my farm, 180 acres in Meadowbrook County, about 2 hours north of the city. The house isn't fancy, but it's solid. The land is good. It was paid off long before I got sick, and I made arrangements to keep the taxes current until you turned 18. It's yours now, free and clear. Do with it what you will. Sell it if you need the money, live there if you need a home, or let it sit and think about it until you figure out what you want. But know this, you come from good people, Marcus. Your mother had her demons, and I had mine. But we also had strength and stubbornness and a refusal to quit even when quitting made sense. You have that in you too. I've seen it in the few reports I got about you over the years. Use it. Build something. Become someone. Not for me, not for your mother, but for yourself. You deserve a chance that life hasn't given you yet. Maybe this farm can be that chance. With all my love, your grandmother, Dorothy Chun. I read the letter 3 times, each time hoping the words would change, that I'd misunderstood, that this wasn't real. But the key in my hand was solid and real, and the address on the tag was specific. 4247, County Road 16, Hartwell, Meadowbrook County. I pulled out my phone, the cheap prepaid one I'd bought with some of my first paychecks, and looked up the address. It existed. The property existed. And according to the county records I found after some searching, it was listed under the name Dorothy Chun, with a note that said, Estate pending transfer to heir. If you're still with me, thank you for being here. I know this is a long story, but every part of it matters. Before I continue, I'm curious, where are you watching this from right now? Are you somewhere safe and warm? Or are you facing your own struggles, trying to figure out how to keep going when everything seems impossible? Drop your location in the comments. I'd love to know where this story is reaching, and I'd love to hear about your own journey. And if this story is resonating with you, if you're finding something meaningful in Marcus's struggle, please hit that subscribe button. There are so many more stories like this one, stories about people who refused to give up even when the world counted them out. And I want to share all of them with you. Your support means everything. I spent that night on the bench, but I didn't sleep. I kept pulling out that letter, rereading it by the light of my phone, trying to understand what it meant. I had a grandmother I barely remembered who'd left me a farm. A farm. 180 acres of land and a house that was apparently paid off and waiting for me. It seemed impossible, like something from a story, not something that happened to kids who aged out of foster care with nothing. But the key was real, solid metal in my palm, and the letter was real, written in ink that had faded slightly, but was still clearly legible. The next morning, I used some of my remaining money to buy a bus ticket to Hartwell, a small town in Meadowbrook County that appeared to be about 2 hours north, like my grandmother had said. The ticket cost $28, which left me with less than $20, but what choice did I have? I couldn't stay in the city with no job, no prospects, and winter coming on. Even if the farm turned out to be nothing, even if the house was falling apart or the whole thing was some kind of mistake, at least I'd know. At least I tried. The bus ride took almost 3 hours because it stopped in every tiny town along the way, picking up and dropping off people whose lives seemed infinitely more settled than mine. I watched the landscape change through the grimy window as the city gradually gave way to suburbs, then to farmland and forests. It was late October now, and the trees were in full autumn color, blazing reds and golds against the gray sky. I'd spent so long focused on survival in the urban environment that I'd forgotten how beautiful the natural world could be, how much space existed outside the concrete and steel I'd known my entire life. Hartwell turned out to be exactly the kind of small town you'd expect, the kind with a main street that had a hardware store, a diner, a bank, and a general store that looked like it had been there since the 1950s. The bus dropped me off in front of the post office, and I stood there with my backpack, holding that key, and trying to figure out what to do next. According to the address on the key tag, The farm was somewhere on County Road 16, but I had no idea where that was or how to get there. I was standing there trying to decide whether to ask for directions when an older woman came out of the post office and stopped when she saw me. "You lost, honey?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular kind of concern that small-town people have for strangers. "Not lost exactly," I said. "Just trying to figure out how to get to County Road 16. Her expression changed immediately, shifting from general concern to specific interest. "County Road 16? You wouldn't happen to be heading out to the old Chin place, would you?" I stared at her, surprised. "Yeah, actually. How did you know?" She smiled, and it was warm and genuine. "Because you look just like Dorothy Chin did when she was young. Same eyes, same jawline, same way of standing like you're ready for a fight. You must be her grandson. Marcus, is it? She talked about you sometimes, said she had a grandson in the city she never got to see as much as she wanted." I nodded, not trusting my voice to work properly. This woman, this stranger, knew my grandmother, remembered her, and apparently saw something of her in me. It was more connected to my past than I'd had in years. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Foster, said she'd been friends with my grandmother for over 30 years, and before I could process what was happening, she'd loaded me into her old pickup truck and was driving me out to the farm. She talked the whole way, filling the silence with stories about Dorothy Chun, painting a picture of a woman I'd never really known. "Your grandmother was one of the strongest people I ever met," Margaret said as we drove down increasingly narrow roads. "She raised your mother by herself after your grandfather died in a farm accident when your mom was just a baby. Worked that farm alone for 40 years, never complained, never asked for help. She loved that land, loved the work of it, loved the cycle of seasons and the satisfaction of bringing things to life from the soil. It broke her heart when your mother left, when things went bad. She blamed herself, thought maybe if she'd done something different, your mom would have turned out okay." "My mother had problems," I said quietly. "That wasn't my grandmother's fault." Margaret glanced at me, and her expression softened. "No, it wasn't. But parents always blame themselves anyway, especially mothers. Dorothy tried to stay in touch with your mom, tried to help, but your mother kept pushing her away, kept moving around, and eventually, the connection just broke. When Dorothy found out about you, found out she had a grandson she'd never met, she was devastated. She tried to get custody when your mother died, tried everything she could think of, but she was already sick by then, and the system decided you were better off where you were. She never forgave them for that." We turned onto a gravel driveway marked by a weathered mailbox with Chun painted on the side in faded letters. The driveway curved through a tunnel of trees that were dropping their leaves in carpets of red and gold. And then we emerged into a clearing, and there it was. The farm spread out before me like something from a dream I didn't know I'd had. The house was a 2-story farmhouse, white paint peeling in places, but the structure looked solid. It had a wide front porch that wrapped around 2 sides, a steep roof with a chimney rising from the center, and windows that reflected the afternoon light. Behind the house stood a large red barn, its paint faded but its frame still standing straight. Beyond that, fields stretched out to distant tree lines, rolling gently like waves frozen in time. It was more land than I'd ever imagined owning, more space than I'd ever thought I'd have any claim to. Margaret pulled up in front of the house and turned off the engine. We sat there in silence for a moment, and I realized my hands were shaking again. This was mine. All of this. This entire place. This beautiful, forgotten farm with its peeling paint and wild gardens and 180 acres of possibility belonged to me. My grandmother had held on to it through her illness, had kept it waiting for me, had believed I'd need it someday. "Take your time," Margaret said gently. "The key should work for both the front and back doors. Dorothy always kept the place locked up, even though we don't get much trouble out here. She wanted to make sure it stayed safe for you." I climbed out of the truck, shouldered my backpack, and walked toward the house on legs that felt unsteady. The porch steps creaked under my weight, but they held. The porch boards needed some work in spots, but the roof overhead looked intact. There was a swing at one end, chains rusted but still attached, moving slightly in the breeze. I could imagine my grandmother sitting there in the evenings, watching the sunset over her fields, maybe thinking about my mother and me, maybe wondering if we'd ever come home. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the front door swung open with a groan that echoed through the empty house. I stepped inside and was immediately hit by the smell of old wood, dust, and something floral that might have been my grandmother's perfume still lingering after all these years. The entry hall opened into a large living room with hardwood floors and windows that let in streams of afternoon light. The furniture was still there, covered in white sheets that gave everything a ghostly appearance. There was a brick fireplace along one wall and built-in bookshelves on either side of it, still filled with books nobody had bothered to pack away. I moved through the house slowly, taking in each room, trying to understand that this was real. The kitchen was outdated but functional, with blue countertops and white cabinets that had yellowed with age. There was a table by the window that looked out over what had once been a garden and was now mostly overgrown with weeds. Upstairs, there were 4 bedrooms, all furnished, all frozen in time like a museum to a life that had ended 5 years ago. One room was clearly my grandmother's, with a quilt on the bed and photographs on the dresser. I picked up one frame and saw a picture of a young woman holding a baby. My mother and I realized. I was maybe 6 months old, and my mother looked so young, probably barely 20, with those same dark eyes I saw in the mirror and a smile that suggested she still had hope. Another photograph showed a teenage girl standing in front of this very house, arms crossed, expression defiant. My mother, again, probably around 15 or 16, was already showing signs of the restlessness that would eventually consume her. Another bedroom had clearly been my mother's room when she was growing up. There was a twin bed with a faded pink comforter, a desk covered in dust, and posters on the walls of bands from the 1990s. It was like stepping into a time capsule, seeing the room of the girl my mother had been before everything went wrong. On the desk, I found a stack of notebooks filled with her handwriting, diary entries and sketches, and fragments of poems that showed a creative, sensitive person I'd never known existed. The third bedroom was smaller, simpler, with just a single bed and a dresser. But on the walls, someone had painted a mural of a forest scene, with tall trees and a stream running through it. The paint had faded, but the skill was evident. My grandmother's work, I guessed, or maybe my mother's. A room made for a child who'd never come, prepared for visits that never happened, waiting for a grandson who didn't know it existed. I sat down on the bed in that room and let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. Grief for the grandmother I'd never known, for the mother I'd lost, for all the years we could have had together if things had been different. But also something else. Hope. For the first time since walking out of Riverside, I felt like maybe I had a chance. Maybe I could build something here, create a life that was actually mine instead of just surviving whatever got thrown at me. When I finally pulled myself together and went back downstairs, I found Margaret in the kitchen, looking through the cabinets. She'd apparently decided waiting in the truck was taking too long. She turned when she heard me and gave me a sympathetic look that suggested she knew exactly what I'd been doing upstairs. "The house needs work," she said matter-of-factly. "But the structure is solid. Dorothy took care of things properly right up until she couldn't anymore. The roof was replaced about 10 years ago, and the plumbing was updated at the same time. You'll need to turn the utilities back on, obviously, and there's probably some repairs needed here and there, but it's livable. Better than livable, really. It's a good house on good land, and it's yours free and clear." She walked over to the window and looked out at the fields. "The land hasn't been farmed in about 5 years, since your grandmother got too sick to manage it. It's been sitting fallow, which isn't ideal, but it also means the soil has had time to rest. If you wanted to work it again, you'd need equipment and knowledge and money to get started. But there's potential here, real potential, if you're willing to put in the work. I don't know the first thing about farming, I admitted. I grew up in the city. I've never even planted a garden. Margaret smiled. Well, that's what neighbors are for. My husband Tom and I live about 3 miles down the road. We've been farming our whole lives, and we'd be happy to help you figure things out. And if farming isn't what you want to do, you've got options. This much land, this close to the county line, you could sell it for good money. Or lease it to someone else to work while you figure out what you want. Point is, you've got choices now, Marcus. Real choices. We spent the next hour walking around the property. Margaret pointed out various features and told me stories about my grandmother, painting a picture of a life lived with purpose and dignity despite hardship. The barn was in decent shape considering its age, though it hadn't housed animals in years. There was an old chicken coop that had partially collapsed, several sheds containing rusted equipment, and what looked like it had once been a vegetable garden, but was now completely overrun with weeds and wild growth. Your grandmother kept chickens up until about 6 months before she died, Margaret said. Sold eggs at the farmer's market in town every Saturday. People loved her eggs, said they were the best in the county. She had a way with animals, a patience most people don't have. She used to say that farming taught you how to wait, how to trust in processes you couldn't control or rush. By the time Margaret drove me back into town, the sun was setting, and I'd made a decision. I wasn't going back to the city. I wasn't going back to sleeping on benches and getting rejected from jobs and slowly drowning in a system that didn't care whether I lived or died. This farm was mine, and I was going to figure out how to make it work. I didn't know how yet, didn't have a plan or the skills or any real idea what I was doing, but I'd survived worse with less. At least here I had shelter, land, and neighbors who seemed willing to help. Margaret dropped me off at the Hartwell Inn, a small bed and breakfast on Main Street, and insisted on paying for 2 nights over my protests. She said Dorothy would have wanted someone to look after me while I got settled, and she wasn't taking no for an answer. She also invited me to dinner at her house the following evening. Said her husband, Tom, would want to meet me, and they could start helping me make a plan for what came next. That night, lying in an actual bed with clean sheets and a door I could lock between me and the world, I pulled out my grandmother's letter and read it again. You deserve a chance that life hasn't given you yet. Maybe this farm can be that chance. She'd been right. I did deserve a chance, and against all odds, she'd given me one. Now I had to figure out what to do with it. The next morning, I went back to the farm with Margaret and Tom, who turned out to be a solid, practical man in his 60s with calloused hands and a way of explaining things that made them seem less overwhelming. We walked the entire property, and Tom made lists of what needed immediate attention versus what could wait. The house needed the utilities turned back on, which meant calling the electric company, the water company, and the propane supplier. There were minor repairs needed, some windows that didn't seal properly, a few boards on the porch that needed replacing, but nothing catastrophic. The biggest question, Tom said as we stood in one of the fields, is what you want to do with the land. You've got options here. You could sell the whole thing, which, based on current market values, would probably net you somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000 after taxes and fees. That's life-changing money for someone your age. Or, I prompted, or you could work it yourself. But that's not simple. You'd need equipment, seed, and knowledge you don't have yet. Takes capital to get started, and even then, farming's a risk. Weather, markets, a million things that can go wrong. Most young people starting don't make it without significant financial backing or family support. What's the third option? I asked. Tom smiled. The smart option for someone in your position. You lease the land to an established farmer, someone who knows what they're doing and has the equipment. They pay you a monthly or annual fee. You get a steady income without having to do the work yourself, and you can use that time and money to figure out what you really want to do. Maybe you go to school, maybe you learn farming gradually. Maybe you discover you want to do something completely different. Point is, you buy yourself time to make good decisions instead of desperate ones. It made sense. After years of making desperate decisions because I had no other choice, the idea of buying myself time to think, to plan, to actually consider what I wanted instead of just what I needed to survive was incredibly appealing. Over the next few weeks, Tom helped me navigate the practical realities of taking over the property. We got the utilities turned on, which involved phone calls and deposits, and forms that made my head spin. We found a local farmer named David Martinez who was interested in leasing the land for hay production, $600 a month for a year-long lease with an option to renew. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a steady income, enough to cover my basic needs while I figured out what came next. The house became my project. I threw myself into cleaning and small repairs with an intensity that probably wasn't entirely healthy, but I needed to stay busy. Staying busy meant I didn't have time to panic about all the things I didn't know, all the ways this could still fall apart. Tom and some of his semi-retired friends helped with the bigger repairs, replacing broken windows, fixing plumbing issues, and getting the old wood stove in the living room working again for heat. They charged me for materials, but donated most of their labor, saying they were doing it for Dorothy, that she'd been good to them over the years, and they wanted to honor her memory by helping her grandson. I chose my grandmother's old bedroom as my own, the one with the quilt and the photographs. It felt right, sleeping in the same room where she'd slept, surrounded by reminders of the life she'd lived. I found more of her things as I cleaned, journals she'd kept about the farm, recipes written in her careful handwriting, and photographs of people I didn't recognize, but who were clearly important to her. Each discovery felt like getting to know her a little better, building a relationship with someone I'd never really had the chance to meet. The room that had been my mother's became a different kind of sanctuary. I spent hours reading her diary entries, trying to understand who she'd been before the addiction took over. She'd been creative, sensitive, full of dreams about leaving the farm and seeing the world. She'd felt trapped by the smallness of Hartwell, suffocated by the expectation that she'd stay and farm like her mother had. There was anger in those pages too, teenage rage at a world that felt too small and a future that felt predetermined. I understood that anger. I'd felt it myself, though mine had been directed at different circumstances. Margaret and Tom became something like family. They checked on me regularly, invited me for meals, taught me basic skills I'd never learned in foster care. Things like how to cook actual food instead of surviving on fast food and microwave meals, how to manage money beyond just stretching it as far as possible, and how to plan beyond next week or next month. For the first time in my life, I had adults in my life who weren't paid to be there, who chose to invest time in me because they wanted to, not because it was their job. Winter came early that year, and I learned quickly that heating an old farmhouse was expensive. The propane bills were shocking, and I had to get creative about staying warm. I spent most of my time in the living room where the wood stove was, learning to keep a fire going and rationing my heat to just the rooms I used. It was still infinitely better than sleeping on park benches or in shelters, but it was a reminder that owning property didn't solve all problems. It just changed which problems you had to solve. The lease money from David covered basics: food, utilities, gas for the old truck Tom had helped me buy for $800, but there wasn't much left over. I needed more income, which meant finding work. The problem was that Hartwell was small, opportunities were limited, and most jobs didn't pay much. I ended up working part-time at the hardware store on Main Street, stocking shelves and helping customers, making $10 an hour. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and the owner, a man named Frank Peterson who'd known my grandmother, was patient about teaching me things I didn't know about tools and materials in home repair. "Your grandmother was one of our best customers," Frank told me one day while we were organizing inventory. "She knew more about fixing things than most men I've met. Self-reliant, that's what she was. Didn't call someone to fix things she could figure out herself. You've got that same quality, I can see it. You don't just accept things the way they are, you figure out how to make them better." By February, I'd been on the farm for 4 months, and something had shifted inside me. The desperation that had driven me since leaving Riverside had eased, replaced by something steadier, a sense of purpose that came from taking care of something, from building instead of just surviving. The house was warmer, cleaner, more like a home and less like a museum. I'd painted the kitchen a warm yellow, replaced the broken cabinet doors, and fixed the leaky faucet I'd been ignoring. Small improvements, but they added up to something that felt like progress. I started exploring the property more thoroughly in the early spring when the weather warmed enough to make walking the land pleasant. I found things I'd missed initially: an old greenhouse behind the barn with most of its glass intact, a spring-fed pond in the back 40 acres that was full of frogs and cattails, and an orchard that had gone wild but still had apple and pear trees that looked like they'd produce fruit if someone cared for them. Each discovery felt like a gift my grandmother had left, layers of possibility I was only beginning to understand. Tom suggested I might want to try my hand at a small garden, just a quarter-acre to start, see if I had any aptitude for growing things. He helped me prepare the soil, taught me about pH levels and soil composition and crop rotation. Margaret gave me seeds she'd saved from her own garden, heirloom varieties that had been passed down through generations. And in late March, I planted my first garden, rows of tomatoes and beans and squash and lettuce, following the diagrams Tom had drawn for me and hoping I didn't kill everything through ignorance. The waiting was hard. Planting something and then having to trust that it would grow, that you'd done enough, that nature would do its part, required a kind of faith I wasn't used to having. I checked the garden obsessively at first, looking for signs of growth, worried that nothing would happen. But then tiny green shoots started appearing, pushing through the soil with a determination that seemed almost miraculous. Things I had planted were growing, coming to life, responding to the care I'd given them. It was the first time I'd ever created something living, and the feeling was indescribable. Around this time, I got an unexpected visitor. I was working in the garden one afternoon when a car pulled up the driveway. A woman in her 30s got out, professional clothes, briefcase, the kind of person who clearly wasn't from around here. She introduced herself as Sarah Patterson, a social worker from the county office. My first instinct was panic. Social services showing up was never good news in my experience. But Sarah smiled and held up her hands in a peaceable gesture. "You're not in trouble, Marcus. I'm just here to check on you, see how you're managing. When someone ages out of foster care and we lose track of them, we're supposed to do follow-up visits when we can, make sure they're okay. You disappeared pretty thoroughly. It took me a while to track you down." We sat on the porch, and I told her about the inheritance, about the farm, about Margaret and Tom and the life I was building. She listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally, and when I finished, she looked genuinely happy. "This is incredible, Marcus. Most kids in your situation struggle. They end up homeless, in bad situations, making desperate choices. But you found a way out. You got lucky with the inheritance, yes, but you're also doing the work. You're building something stable. That takes courage and intelligence and persistence. You should be proud of yourself." It was strange, hearing a social worker, someone who represented the system that had failed me in so many ways, tell me she was proud of me. But it also felt validating, like maybe I wasn't just barely surviving. Maybe I was actually succeeding. Sarah left me her card and told me to call if I ever needed help or resources. She also mentioned that there were programs available for former foster youth, things like educational grants and job training, and support services I might qualify for. I filed the information away, not sure if I'd use it, but grateful to know it existed. As spring turned to summer, the garden flourished beyond my expectations. The tomato plants grew tall and heavy with fruit. The beans climbed the poles I'd set up for them. The squash spread out in enthusiastic vines that threatened to take over the entire plot. Margaret taught me how to harvest properly, how to know when things were ripe, and how to preserve what I couldn't eat immediately through canning and freezing. I spent evenings on the porch shelling beans and cutting up vegetables, and for the first time in my life, I understood what people meant when they talked about honest work, about the satisfaction that came from producing something useful with your own hands. Tom suggested I might want to sell some of my excess produce at the farmer's market that ran in town every Saturday. I was nervous about it, about putting myself out there in such a public way, but I agreed to try. That first Saturday in July, I loaded up the truck with baskets of tomatoes, beans, squash, and lettuce, and drove into town before dawn to set up a small table at the market. I priced everything cheaper than the other vendors, not sure if anyone would buy from some kid they didn't know, but by 9 a.m., I was nearly sold out. People kept saying the same thing, that my vegetables reminded them of the ones my grandmother used to sell, that they'd missed having the Chun farm at the market. Some older residents told me stories about Dorothy, about how she'd been a fixture at the market for 40 years, how her produce had been legendary for its quality. I wasn't sure I could live up to that reputation, but I was willing to try. The farmer's market became a weekly ritual, and with it came a steady stream of additional income. Some weeks I made $200, some weeks more, depending on what was in season and how much I'd managed to harvest. Combined with my hardware store wages and the lease money, I was actually making enough to live on with some leftover to save. It wasn't wealth, but it was security, and security was something I'd never had before. I made friends at the market too. Other vendors who welcomed me into their community, customers who came back week after week, and young people my age who worked at their family farms and understood the challenges I was facing. For someone who'd spent most of his life isolated by circumstances, surrounded by people, but never really connecting with them, having genuine friends felt revolutionary. One of those friends was a girl named Emma Chun, no relation despite the shared last name. She was 20, had graduated from high school 2 years earlier, and was helping her parents run their farm while figuring out whether she wanted to go to college or stay in farming. She had dark hair, bright eyes, and a laugh that made me smile every time I heard it. She started stopping by my table at the market, ostensibly to compare crop notes, but clearly also because she enjoyed talking to me. And I discovered, to my surprise, that I enjoyed talking to her too. By August, Emma and I were spending time together outside of market days. She'd come by the farm to help with harvests, and I'd go to her family's place to learn from her parents, who had decades of experience. Her father, Robert Chun, was particularly generous with his knowledge, teaching me about pest management, irrigation, soil health, all the things I'd been learning through trial and error and would have taken years to figure out on my own. If you're still here, thank you so much for staying with this story. Before I continue, I want to ask you something. What's the biggest risk you've ever taken? The moment when you had to choose between staying in a bad situation or jumping into the unknown, even though you weren't sure you'd survive? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. This community is built on shared experiences, on the understanding that we're all fighting our own battles, and sometimes just knowing someone else has been there too makes all the difference. And please, if this story means something to you, hit that subscribe button. There are so many more stories about people who found their way through impossible situations, and I want to share all of them with you. The summer was the best time I could remember having since before my mother died. The farm was producing, I was making money, I had friends, and something resembling a social life. Emma and I weren't officially together, but there was something between us, something neither of us had named yet, but both of us felt. She'd sit on my porch in the evenings after we finished whatever work needed doing, and we'd talk about our dreams, our fears, our plans for futures that were starting to seem possible instead of just survivable. But good things never seem to last without complications. In September, I got a letter from the county tax assessor's office. Due to some confusion about the estate transfer and back taxes that hadn't been properly accounted for, I owed $8,500 in property taxes immediately, with penalties accruing daily if I didn't pay. My grandmother had kept the taxes current up until her death, but there had been a gap in the years since, and now it was my responsibility to settle it. $8,500 might as well have been $8 million. I had maybe $3,000 saved, and that was supposed to be my emergency fund, my buffer against disaster. I couldn't get a loan, my credit didn't exist, and banks don't lend to 18-year-olds with no collateral beyond land they're trying to save. I could sell some of the land, but that would take time I didn't have, and dividing the property might affect its overall value. The pressure of it kept me up at night, brought back all the old anxieties about losing everything, about ending up back where I started. I didn't want to ask for help. Pride, stubbornness, the same quality my grandmother had that made her refuse help even when she needed it. But Tom noticed something was wrong, pulled it out of me one evening, and within a week, he'd organized something I never expected. A fundraiser at the community center, a dinner and auction where local farmers and businesses donated items and services to be bid on, with all proceeds going to help me keep the farm. The night of the fundraiser, I stood in the back of the community center and watched as nearly 200 people showed up. People I knew and people I didn't, all there because they'd heard about Dorothy Chin's grandson, who was trying to keep the family farm going, who was doing right by the land and the community. They ate the casseroles and desserts that had been donated. They bid enthusiastically on everything from homemade quilts to tractor repair services, and by the end of the night, they'd raised $9,200. I tried to thank everyone, to express what it meant to me, but I couldn't find the words. Margaret put her hand on my shoulder and said, "This is what community means, Marcus. We take care of our own. Your grandmother was part of this community for 40 years, and now you are too. We don't let our people lose their land if we can help it." I paid the tax bill the next morning, with enough left over to put back into savings. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the responsibility. All these people had invested in me, had put their faith and their money behind the belief that I could make this work. I couldn't let them down. I couldn't let myself down. That fall, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to stop leasing the land and start farming it myself. Not all of it, not at first, but enough to build a real business, to create something sustainable instead of just getting by. Tom and Robert both thought I was crazy, pointed out that I'd only been gardening for 6 months, and farming was exponentially more complex and risky. But Emma supported me, said she'd help, and her parents reluctantly agreed to guide me through the process. I used my savings to buy a used tractor and some basic equipment. Tom helped me plan what to plant and where, helped me understand the economics of farming, the thin margins, and the endless variables. We decided to focus on vegetables for the farmers market and direct-to-consumer sales, things I could manage without huge infrastructure or equipment. It was risky. Everything could still fail, but at least it would be my failure or my success, built on my own effort instead of just luck. That winter, I planned. I read books about farming, watched videos, and talked to every farmer who'd give me the time of day. I prepared the soil, fixed up the greenhouse so I could start seeds early, and built cold frames for extending the growing season. I worked at the hardware store during the day and on the farm every other moment, driven by a determination that bordered on obsession. Emma was there through all of it, helping, advising, occasionally telling me when I was being an idiot and needed to slow down. And sometime during that winter, the something between us became something official. We were together, partners in work and life, building something neither of us could have built alone. Spring came, and I planted 20 acres of vegetables, more than I'd ever managed before, a massive gamble that kept me up at night worrying about all the things that could go wrong. But the plants grew, the weather cooperated, and by early summer, I was harvesting more produce than I'd ever imagined possible. I sold at the farmers market, started a CSA program where people could buy shares of the harvest, and developed relationships with restaurants in the larger towns nearby who wanted local produce. The farm was working, not just surviving, but actually working as a business. I wasn't getting rich. Farming never makes anyone rich, but I was making a living, building equity, creating something sustainable. The house was fully repaired now, warm in winter and comfortable in summer. The barn housed equipment instead of standing empty. The greenhouse was full of seedlings for the next planting. The orchard had been pruned and was producing fruit again. The land my grandmother had left me was alive again, producing food, supporting a life, fulfilling the purpose she'd imagined when she decided to leave it to me. I'm 21 now and have been on the farm for 3 years. Emma and I got married last spring in a small ceremony in the garden, with Margaret and Tom standing up as my family since I didn't have any blood relatives left. The farm supports both of us now, still modestly but sustainably, with room to grow as we get better at what we're doing and expand our operations gradually. The kids from Riverside who laughed at me when I left, who bet on how quickly I'd fail, who saw me as just another statistic waiting to happen, they have no idea what I've built. They don't know about the farm or the community I'm part of, or the life I've created from literally nothing. And honestly, I don't need them to know. I'm not doing this to prove them wrong. I'm doing it because my grandmother believed I was worth believing in, because she gave me a chance when I had nothing, because she saw something in me I couldn't see in myself. Sometimes I still think about that day on the park bench when Robert Sullivan found me and gave me that envelope. How close I was to giving up, to accepting that life as a foster kid who aged out with nothing was just going to be a slow slide into poverty and desperation. How easily I could have missed the chance she'd given me if Robert hadn't kept his promise to her, if he hadn't spent 2 weeks tracking me down, if I'd been somewhere else that day. I've learned that life isn't fair, that the system doesn't work for everyone, that most kids in my situation don't get miraculous inheritances that save them. But I've also learned that when you do get a chance, even a small one, you have to grab it with both hands and refuse to let go. You have to work harder than seems reasonable, accept help when it's offered even if pride makes you want to refuse, and believe that you're capable of more than your circumstances suggest. The farm has taught me other things, too. Patience, because you can't rush growing things. Humility, because nature doesn't care about your plans and will humble you regularly. Gratitude, because every harvest is a gift that didn't have to happen. And hope, because every spring brings new possibilities, new chances to try again, new opportunities to get it right. I keep my grandmother's letter in a frame on my desk, read it whenever I need reminding of where I came from and why I'm here. You deserve a chance that life hasn't given you yet. Maybe this farm can be that chance. She was right. The farm was that chance. But more than that, it was a beginning, a foundation, a place to build from instead of just something to fall back on. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Your time and attention mean more than you know. Before we finish, I want to ask you one more thing. What did you take away from Marcus's story? What truth resonated with you? Was it about second chances, about the importance of community, about refusing to give up even when everything seems impossible? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and your insights often teach me things I didn't see in my own story. And please, if this story touched you, if it reminded you that circumstances don't have to define outcomes, that even when the world counts you out, you can still find a way forward, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a like. Join this community of people who believe that everyone deserves a chance, that hard work and help from others can overcome incredible obstacles, and that the end of one chapter can be the beginning of something better. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this journey. Remember, your worth isn't determined by where you started, but by what you choose to build with what you're given. You're stronger than you think, more capable than your circumstances suggest, and you deserve a chance even if life hasn't given you one yet. Keep fighting. Keep building. Keep believing that something better is possible. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.